Bon après-midi. Alors que nous nous réunissons en ligne aujourd'hui pour parler de la situation en Iran, lors d'une conférence avec des collègues du Parlement européen, nous sommes dans des circonstances totalement différentes de celles d'octobre dernier, lorsque nous avons eu une conférence similaire dans le bâtiment du Parlement européen à Bruxelles sur la politique de l'Union européenne en Iran. Je suis heureuse que dans cette conférence en ligne également, nous avons une longue liste de collègues qui participeront avec leur discours et cela indique que rien ne peut nous entraver dans nos efforts pour la démocratie et les droits de l'homme en Iran, pas même Covid-19. Nous avons une longue liste d'orateurs parmi nos collègues qui présenteront leur discours au fur et à mesure. Et il y en a beaucoup d'autres qui ont tenu à participer à cette conférence, mais ils regrettent de ne pas pouvoir, en raison de leur autre engagement. Je commence par notre première oratrice. Mesdames, Messieurs, j'ai l'honneur et le privilège d'inviter Madame Rajavi, présidente élue du Conseil national de la résistance iranienne, à prendre la parole en tant qu'oratrice principale à cette conférence. Une femme d'un courage, d'une persévérance, d'une honnêteté et d'un altruisme extraordinaire, qui a été une inspiration pour tous les Iraniens, en particulier les femmes d'Iran, qui aspirent à la liberté, aux droits de l'homme, à la démocratie, à la justice sociale et surtout à l'égalité des sexes. Il est dommage que nous ne puissions pas la rencontrer en personne dans le bâtiment du Parlement européen en raison de la pandémie. Mais nous espérons vivement qu'il sera bientôt possible de l'accueillir à nouveau comme avant. Madame Rajavi, nous vous souhaitons tous la bienvenue et vous savez la parole. Bienvenue.
Honorable representatives, I thank you for having this opportunity to speak to you. I appreciate your continued attention to the plight of the people of Iran and their desire for freedom against the religious dictatorship. Dozens of political prisoners are on the death row in Iran. Political prisoners are under torture. Today, you can hear families of thousands of those killed in recent protests calling on Europe and the world to stand by them. This regime is facing the anger and discontent of the vast majority of the Iranian people. In addition to thousands of large and small protests, 5 major uprisings have erupted in Iran since January 2018. Truck drivers, teachers, nurses, college students, factory workers, and oil workers time and again rose up and cried out their protests. The resistance units and courageous youth, through their activities, have had a great impact on shattering the atmosphere of fear and terror. They are paving the way for further protests and uprisings. Distinguished parliamentarians, the mullahs' inhuman policies are surprising for some people. Why do they execute a young national champion, Navid Afkari, despite global and domestic protests? Why do they target airports, oil installations, and oil tankers? And why don't they give up their nuclear and missile programs or their criminal wars in the Middle East? No more illusions are left today about the regime moderating or changing its behavior. Years ago, the European Troika experienced human rights dialogue, critical dialogue, and constructive engagement with this regime. The outcome of each of these policies was just disastrous. The JCPOA also led to nothing but reinforcement of the IRGC, further suppression of the people of Iran, warmongering in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and more terrorism in Europe and other countries. It got to a point where 3 years after the nuclear deal and lifting of the sanctions, a so-called diplomat of the regime carried a bomb with him in Europe. Then he personally handed it over to his agents to blow up the annual gathering of the Iranian resistance in Paris. Before that, he had personally traveled to Paris in June 2017 to gather information on the relevant places to carry out the horrific plan the following year. To coordinate with the officials in Iran, he traveled there at least 6 times in the first half of 2018. Today, he is imprisoned in Belgium, and his trial is going to be held next month. This terrorist plot, if succeeded, falls in the category of crime against humanity and one of the greatest terrorist disasters in Europe. In my testimony to the investigation, I presented the documents emphasizing that this criminal plan had been decided in the regime's Supreme Security Council, headed by Hassan Rouhani and carried out on the orders of Ali Khamenei. Therefore, Khamenei, Rouhani, Zarif, and Alawi, the regime's intelligence minister, must face justice. The big question, however, is this: why has the regime become so emboldened to engage one of their diplomats directly in a terrorist operation? One reason is that the regime is desperate in the face of the Iranian people's protests and the significant role of the Iranian resistance in the uprisings. But another reason is that the regime was confident that it would not pay any price for committing such major terrorist crime in the heart of Europe due to the ongoing policy of appeasement. Indeed, how could the EU turn a blind eye on the regime's agents and spies who are on the move on European soil? European intelligence services have repeatedly reported that the regime's embassies are centers of espionage and operations against dissidents, especially the PMOI. Dear friends, opposition to the extension of the arms embargo against the regime, inaction vis-à-vis human rights abuses in Iran are not acceptable. Indifference towards constant movement of the intelligence ministry and Quds Force agents in Europe and giving them free hand to do business are all against the interests of the people of Iran and global peace and security. The developments of the past year have shown that the people of Iran are ready to overthrow the clerical regime and establish a pluralist republic based on separation of religion and state, gender equality, abolition of the death penalty, respect for the rights of ethnic groups, and a non-nuclear Iran. In such circumstances, the security of Europe, its long-term economic interests, and its relations with the Middle East depend on its decision to stand by the people of Iran and not by the mullahs. Honorable representatives, on behalf of the Iranian people's resistance, I propose a policy with 3 elements: human rights for the people of Iran, comprehensive embargo of the religious dictatorship, and recognition of the Iranian people's resistance for freedom and democracy. I urge the Parliament of Europe to urge the Council of Ministers to adopt a binding legislation to expel the Iranian regime's agents from the European soil, shut down the regime's embassies in all EU member states, and designate the IRGC and its proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and other countries as terrorist groups. An independent international mission must investigate the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran and the slaughter of more than 1,500 protesters by Khamenei during the November 2019 uprising. The mission must also investigate the condition of prisons and prisoners in Iran, particularly the political prisoners. We demand the release of all political prisoners. I sincerely thank members of the European Parliament and the role this body plays in defending the human rights and resistance of the people of Iran. Thank you all very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am pleased to join this gathering. As a member of the European Parliament and chair of the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs of the European Parliament, I would like to salute all of the participants of this conference, always committed to human rights, which means to me and for the European Parliament in all, equal rights. And that is an issue, of course, when it comes to Iran. Just this morning, we had a debate with High Representative Borrell on the situation on Iran. We made a point, yes, we stand by the European Union's position to uphold the so-called Joint Commission, which secures the understanding that proliferation of weapons will be deterred, will be prevented when it comes to nuclear, ballistic or conventional weapons as well. But by the same token, we insist from the European Parliament that the European Union must be significant when making the case of equal human rights, equal rights before the law in Iran. And that is something that is of the essence, particularly in view of the 2019 uprisings where at least 12,000 were arrested. There was police brutality and repression, ongoing, always the same issue, repression against dissidents in Iran. Execution of the death penalty is also frequent and systematic as a punishment for dissidents. Discrimination against entire categories of persons. To begin with, women is also an outstanding priority for the European Union External Action Service and for the diplomatic efforts that are to be made to stop that from happening. Iranian women face discrimination, personal status matters relate to marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody. Iranian law allows girls at 13 and boys at 15 to get married, despite the efforts to increase that minimum age that have been prevented by the Iranian leading authorities. Iranian law denies freedom of religion, as so many other freedom and fundamental rights. So we make a case by saying that, yes, we are making an effort to prevent proliferation of weapons and to stand by the agreement that made it possible. But we also have a duty, moral, political, legal duty, to stand up for rights, human rights in Iran, and particularly respect for dissenters and political opposition. That is why I can only salute this opportunity to spread this message on behalf of the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs of the European Parliament. Wish you well.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be together with you, Madam Rajavi, dear colleagues. My name is Rasa Juknevičienė. I am a member of European Parliament from Lithuania. I am very familiar with the cause of freedom. I come from a background that fought for freedom, and my family was a victim of the communists. But finally the day came where my country was freed. This is why I support your cause and support the call for democracy in Iran, as well as Belarus, Russia also, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and etc. Over the past year, human rights violations by the Iranian regime have been on full display, exposing the mullahs' brutal suppression. The Amnesty International report early September on the torture and treatment of the November 2019 protests detainees is shocking. Increasing arbitrary arrests and the torture of young people, including women, who are Iran's elite and assets that any country would have been proud to have, in order to get forced confessions, is vicious. Navid Afkari, 27-year-old wrestling champion, who would have been promoted and taken care of by any other country to bring it a gold medal, is tortured and executed by the regime for defying it and participating in anti-governmental protests, despite calls from around the globe to save his life. The regime resorts to these types of crimes out of desperation because Iran's situation is explosive. Daily protests continue in Iran. The message is clear. On the one hand, the Iranian people don't want this regime and oppose it. And on the other hand, a powerful alternative exists, meaning that change in Iran is imminent and the regime is terrified by this ultimate fate, as like other regimes all over the globe, including Europe. Given these circumstances, what should our policy be in Europe vis-à-vis the Iranian regime? We must stand by the Iranian people, as doing so is defending our democratic principles. We must stand firm against the regime, condemn its suppression with the strongest terms and hold it to account. We should not be deceived by the regime's lies about the lack of an alternative. All nations have alternatives to brutal and undemocratic regimes. Iran also has alternatives. The time to act is now. Thank you so much for your attention. Mr. Zahradil, a good friend of Free Iran, MEP from Czech, member of European Parliament from Czech Republic.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Wish you all the best from Prague, the Czech Republic, to all of you, to all participants, and to all our friends in Iran, and also to our friends in Iranian exile opposition. I believe that we once again found ourselves in a very crucial point of history where the region itself is becoming more unstable. We can see more regional tensions and even conflicts there. And therefore, we should once again pay more attention also to what's going on in Iran. The thing is that we all know, we are all aware that the very core of Iranian regime didn't change. It is not changing, and it is not going to change without external pressure. It is fundamentalist regime. It is dictatorship. It is brutal theocracy, and its very foundations are contrary to some basic human rights concept as we understand it in our democratic societies. But unfortunately, we have to admit that also the EU approach didn't change much, and that European Union and many governments in Europe are still constantly underestimating the nature of the Iranian regime. It's basically anti-Western nature and the threat which this regime could pose for Europe and for generally democratic societies all around the world. And therefore, I believe that it's once again time to push, excuse me, Mr. Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, to start some actions, and also to explain to him that it is in our common interest, in the interest of Europe and in the interest of European democracies, not just to watch, but to act. And I believe that we also can take some actions, some measures on national levels of our individual member states, but it's important to have also some actions taken on the level of European institutions, European Parliament, European Commission, and European Council. And as we all know, there is only one political force which is so well organized and so relevant that it could pose the alternative to the current regime in Iran. And this is the PMOI under the leadership of Madam Rajavi. And I see no reason why we shouldn't start on the European level and also on national levels to cooperate more closely, more openly, and more friendly with that political force, because I believe that once they take power in Iran, and I'm sure about that, that this day will come once. So once they take power, they will be able to turn Iran into a fully democratic, transparent country, fight for human rights, fight for equality, fight against corruption. And therefore, I wish them to continue their work. And I wish to all of us to give them every possible support. So you can count on me, as always. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce speaker. Next speaker is Gianna Gaccia from Italy, member of European Parliament from Italy.
Saluto tutti i colleghi, buon pomeriggio. Ovviamente sono d'accordo su tutto quello che è stato detto da chi mi ha preceduto. Da anni seguo la resistenza iraniana, da anni seguo colleghi, buon pomeriggio, ovviamente sono d'accordo. Coraggiosissima. Saluto tutti i colleghi, buon pomeriggio. La coraggiosissima Maria Rajavi. Oggi credo che sia molto importante ribadire la richiesta della signora Rajavi per istituire una missione internazionale indipendente per visitare le carceri dove avvengono vere e proprie torture. Il campo di Ashraf è stato un esempio e c'è una ferocia incredibile e la nostra principale preoccupazione per l'Iran non è ovviamente il singolo prigioniero o la durata del periodo in cui sono stati tenuti in prigione. Quello che è inquietante è il trattamento disumano che ricevono questi prigionieri e anche quello che poi segue, che di solito è l'esecuzione. E i prigionieri politici vengono assolutamente uccisi sotto tortura. Nel suo ultimo rapporto Amnesty International come recentemente rivelato dalla resistenza italiana, credo che l'azione che si debba fare sia assolutamente puntare su una missione internazionale indipendente che possa visitare questi luoghi, questi carceri, perché questa è assolutamente una questione internazionale. Io sarò sempre accanto alla Madame Rajavi e accanto alla resistenza iraniana e vi ringrazio chi ha organizzato questa videoconferenza e speriamo di poter mettere in atto quello che la signora Rajavi da tempo invoca e chiede e credo che sia doveroso per noi europei. Grazie.
So next speaker from European Parliament is Mr. Lopez Isturiz White. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, say hello to my colleague in the European Parliament, Patricia Toia, and then also to Mariam Rajavi, and especially also my good friend Alejo Vidal Cuadras and all the friends. Just I wanted to mention briefly that we all know that the situation in Iran is deteriorating every day, that thousands of peoples have been participating and detained for participating in demonstrations over the past 2 years. This also shows that many people in Iran are tired and fed up with this regime. Also, the regime stability, can be seen in their foreign, actions. The cases now currently being investigated in Belgium about the interference in Belgium. Also, the declared, anti. Agreements, Abraham agreements, declarations from the regime, shows that they don't want to be part, of course, of the evolution of peace and the evolution of good entente between all the actors in the region. The big efforts that are taking place as we speak. Hezbollah, always the armed wing that is, of course, denounced and refused by all the European countries, but also most of them are also now acting against also the political arm of Hezbollah, specifically, after we have seen the intervention of Hezbollah, Syria, and the regime of Iran in Lebanon that has caused so much distress to our good Lebanese friends. There has to be a stop in the external interference, in Lebanon, and finally, for once in history, to leave the Lebanese people to decide their future by themselves. The situation of human rights, of course, in Iran, we all, many of the people connected, we all know very well. The ruthless crackdown of protesters, and also, the executions done against the opposition and protesters. And I have asked in the European Parliament several occasions our representative, Josep Borrell, about the violation of human rights in the country and what's going on. I don't want to take more time from your very interesting discussion and debate, and just to salute everybody and tell them that as my colleague in the European Parliament and many others, we are always there to help in order to bring a prosperous, democratic future for Iran that merits. Because when I speak about Iran, I speak about the Iranian people, not of the regime, but also the Iranian people that they are so desperate seeking for this democratization of the country, for liberties that in the past they had, and it merits that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next is member of European Parliament from Czech Republic, Ms. Veronika Vrecionova.
Okay. Madam President, dear colleagues, thank you for inviting me to this conference. I am glad to be here. Even during these strange times of COVID crisis, we can't forget people who are facing much more worse situation than the coronavirus is. Thousands of death sentences are executed every year. Most of these sentences are abused in non-democratic countries like China and Iran. We should remind this medieval, unjust, cruel practice not only on the occasion of the World Day Against Death Penalty, but all the time. And it should be a task for us, MEPs. As we speak about Iran, we were all witnesses of the execution of Iranian famous wrestler, Navid Afkari. He was one of many who were sentenced to death based on false accusations, international accusation and torture. Other prisoners, men, women, even children, are not famous with international attention, but their lives have no less meaning and their suffering is the same. Iranian vicious practice doesn't have negative impact only on the national level, but the spread of hatred, terrorism, and violent propaganda is like a sickness that is spreading in the area and beyond. Personally, as a member of European Parliament, I am therefore ready to show my support, as I have done many times before, to Iranian people who want freedom, who denounce violence, who want justice in their country, and who want to live in peace. I would like to thank Friends of Free Iran and to the President, Mrs. Rajavi, for organizing this conference, not only to commemorate people who lost their lives too soon, but also to speak up about the terrible practice of Iranian government, to show support to victims of this horrible regime, and to call for the release of prisoners who are held captive without a fair trial. Thank you again for organizing this conference, and I hope to see you next time personally. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. And now we will have Marco Zabi.
Zanni. Thank
Zanni.
you very much.
Okay, it was made mistake. I apologize.
No
Marco Zanni.
problem. No
Sorry.
problem. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this conference supporting Iranian people. Already my colleagues pointed out what is the main point, what we can do to support Iranian people. And we all know that in the last decades, the Iranian regime has been the protagonist of violations of human rights of its citizens. And this is really horrible. In recent months, especially, we have observed new demonstrations against the regime in the name of democracy, demonstration harshly repressed by the Iranian authorities, with many protesters imprisoned and sentenced also to death. There is a particular case that I would like to point out, the recent execution of Navid Afkari, a champion wrestler who confessed the alleged crimes under torture. This is just the latest example of the cruelty of the Iranian regime. And this is a deplorable and violent episode by the hands of the Iranian regime, which ignored totally an international protest for a fair trial, showing a total disregard for the most fundamental human rights standards. And especially this case involved sport. Sport has traditionally been an instrument of unity, of friendship, of brotherhood, and the regime planned the secret execution of Navid Afkari in order to use it as a warning to the population in a climate of increasing social unrest. But in reality, it was a clear admission of weakness. And that was pretty clear. The regime fears to be defeated by the will of the people and knows it was completely unprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic and the following economic crisis. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. Supporting Iranian people in their asking for freedom will show up again the weaknesses of the Iranian regime and will help a democratic transition that Iranian people are asking since many years ago. So thank you very much again for your laudable initiative, and I hope to celebrate with you and all the Iranian people very soon the freedom of the country for a regime that is destroying the people and also destroying one of the beautiful country, of the most beautiful country in the world. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Mr. Zanni. And now we will have a video of Milan Zver, member of European Parliament from Slovenia.
Friends of Free Iran Group in the European Parliament, I am particularly happy to welcome in our midst also Ms. Maryam Rajavi, President-elect of National Council of Resistance of Iran. Our gathering is timely following a statement from High Representative Borrell on situation in Iran in the plenary session today early. Since last November, the most significant protest since 2009 against the Iranian regime began and rapidly spread to at least 100 cities throughout the country. Protesters have expressed numerous economic complaints, while also calling for the structural reform of the political system and condemning current and former Iranian leaders. I've been closely following the developments in Iran. Reports indicate that Iranian security forces have used harmful force in arresting more than 7,000 people and killed hundreds of people in connection with the protests. Terrorist operations of Iranian security forces on European soil are also of great concern and needed to be stopped. I strongly condemned any acts of violence committed by the Iranian regime against the Iranian people, and I am deeply concerned by reports of several fatalities. Let me make this clear. The Islamic Republic must cease violence against its own people and stop any further terrorist plots abroad. I am pleased to observe that the Free Iran gathering abroad and protesters in Iran have also started to show support for the Iranian opposition leader Ms. Maryam Rajavi and her 10 points plan for the future Iran that calls for democracy, modern legal system, respect of human rights and market economy. Ms. Rajavi, I too fully support your unfailing commitments to transform Iran into a democratic and free society. As I have stated many times before, I believe EU should lead stricter policy toward Iran, impose sanctions and demand from Iranian regime to respect human rights and stop execution of political prisoners. Democratic societies should not remain silent in the face of such human rights violations happening in Iran for the past 4 decades. It's our legitimate duty to respond to the people of Iran who are continuing to hold legitimate and peaceful protest against the oppressive and corrupt regime. Thank you for your attention.
The next speaker is Mr. Stefanec from Slovakia, who will be online member of Parliament, European Parliament.
Dear friends, dear Madame Rajavi, topic of today's conference is very crucial. Indeed, an ongoing crime against humanity is happening in Iran. There has been no considerable improvement in human rights situation, if any, but it has worsened. Executions have never stopped. Lack of freedom of speech and assembly, suppression of women and religious minorities continue persistently. The recent shocking report of the Amnesty International on torture sounds the alarm. Iran is on the eve of a great explosion, and we have seen how this regime has brutally suppressed the protesters, killing them at the spot or taking them to its dungeons to be killed under torture or be executed. This is the continuation of the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, which remains unpunished. Now we would like to know where the EU and High Representative stands on the question of human rights in Iran. We do agree that the ongoing crime against humanity has persisted in Iran for too long, and it must be taken and addressed seriously. Human rights should not be seen as a secondary issue which can be overlooked when trying to save the JCPOA or other agreements with this tyrannical regime. Human rights should come first. Our economic in European Union and democratic principles demand that the EU takes the lead in defending the Iranian people's human rights and protesting against the regime for its atrocities. We cannot use soft language to call for restraint when the repressive regime was killing the impoverished protesters in their hundreds during the November 2019 protests in Iran. There is no way that the appalling situation of human rights will change if there is no independent investigation and accountability, and this is the kind of policy and action we expect to see from the EU. In the end, I want to declare my support for the NCRI led by Madame Rajavi and her 10-point plan. I join my colleague at the European Parliament in our support for the alternative that has tried hard to bring democracy, because freedom will shine over Iran very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to thank everyone for this very important meeting, for the possibility myself to attend this meeting. And thank you again, Mrs. Rajavi. Good luck and everything the best in your fight. The rest of the program will be handed over to Mr. Alejo Vidal-Quadras, former Vice President of the European Parliament. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this very timing and so necessary conference call in the difficult circumstances that Iran is going on these days. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to MEP Dirk Jan Epping from Netherlands.
In this important event, as we are highlighting the World Day Against the Death Penalty this week, the Islamic Republic of Iran has some of the most appalling human rights records and has had the highest per capita execution rate in the world for many years. I was shocked to hear about the recent execution of the 27-year-old national hero and wrestler champion Navid Afkari for his participation in anti-government protests. This is totally unacceptable. Unfortunately, we see the EU's appeasement policy with Iran, prioritizing economic interests over human rights, has been aiding the mullahs at a heavy price for the Iranian population. The result is that today we are facing an ever more aggressive and abusive regime, which is not only victimizing its own citizens, but is also exporting terrorism to the rest of the world. So far, the EU has been opposing the reimposition of the UN Security Council sanctions on Iran. They are somehow willingly falling into the Iranian propaganda trap that these sanctions will hurt the people only. The truth is that these UN sanctions are targeting Iran's military and arms sales, the regime's nuclear program, and the notorious Islamic Revolutionary Guard. None of these have anything to do with the people's interest in Iran. In fact, when the sanctions were lifted following the nuclear agreement of 2015, the money that poured into Iran ended up only in the pockets of the Revolutionary Guard and its repressive machine. It helped the mullahs to strengthen their iron grip on the population, and the ordinary citizens became even poorer because of the government corruption and the skyrocketing inflation. It is very shocking that the EU is even considering removing the arms embargo on the Tehran regime, which is the #1 state sponsor on terrorism. This is definitely against our own security in Europe, as well as the security of the people in Iran. We in the EU must stand up against the inhuman theocracy and instead side with the Iranian people and their democratic aspirations. which are, among others, represented in the Iranian resistance under the leadership of Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. I know her very well and have met her here in the European Parliament many times. Let us hope our continued effort will soon bring democracy and freedom in Iran. You can, of course, count on me as always. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Epping. And now I give the floor to the MEP from France, Monsieur Benoît Biteau.
Merci d'abord à tous de m'avoir invité à m'exprimer sur ce sujet-là. C'est un sujet extrêmement grave, extrêmement sérieux. La peine de mort est une pratique d'un autre temps. Et pourtant, selon les Nations Unies, selon Human Rights Watch, selon la Ligue internationale des droits de l'homme ou encore Amnesty International, l'Iran reste le second pays du monde en termes de nombre d'exécutions de prisonniers condamnés à mort et le premier par rapport au nombre d'habitants. En 2018, ils étaient encore plusieurs centaines. Il s'agit donc d'un véritable massacre et nous ne pouvons pas fermer les yeux sur de tels agissements dans cette contrée-là du monde. Le 12 septembre 2020, il n'y a même pas un mois, le lutteur Navid Afkari a été exécuté malgré tous les appels à la clémence, exécuté en cachette, sans que ses avocats soient prévenus, sans même que sa famille soit prévenue, sans même que lui-même soit prévenu de son exécution. Comment peut-on encore fermer les yeux sur cette inhumanité? C'est juste plus possible. Et donc, il faut que cette répression contre les manifestations pour la démocratie fin 2019, qui d'ailleurs a été réprimée sauvagement, soit entendue. Il faut que des dizaines de manifestants qui ont été arrêtés et emprisonnés puissent être libérés, ou que des situations n'arrivent plus là-bas comme ça, que des centaines de familles qui sont sans nouvelles de leurs proches puissent à nouveau avoir des nouvelles de leurs proches, si tant est que le pire ne leur soit pas arrivé. L'Iran reste donc le seul pays au monde qui exécute aussi des enfants. Et là, la situation est encore plus dramatique et on ne peut pas continuer comme ça. D'ailleurs, ma compatriote, l'anthropologue Fariba Adelka, a été arrêtée en juin 2019. Elle a été initialement condamnée à mort suite à une mobilisation, et c'est la preuve qu'il faut rester mobilisé d'ailleurs. Suite à une mobilisation internationale, cette peine de mort ne s'appliquera pas. Néanmoins, Farida Adelka est condamnée à 5 ans de prison et le 3 octobre 2020, elle est sortie de prison, mais avec un bracelet électronique. Donc on voit bien à quel point la justice dans ce pays est contestable. Nous demandons donc qu'elle soit libérée de façon immédiate, sans plus de délai. Depuis que je siège au Parlement européen, j'ai pu constater que nous avons déjà voté à 2 reprises des résolutions qui condamnaient fermement les innombrables violations des droits de l'homme en Iran. Et ce que je peux vous assurer cet après-midi par rapport à cet événement, et j'ai vu vos collègues qui sont place du Luxembourg devant le Parlement, c'est que jusqu'à la fin de mon mandat, vous pourrez compter sur moi pour dénoncer la peine de mort en Iran et de toute façon dans tous les autres pays du monde, qui pour moi n'est que la continuation d'une forme de barbarie, comme on peut encore en trouver en Chine ou aux États-Unis. Et donc il faut sortir de cette situation et faire confiance à l'humanisme plutôt qu'à des pratiques d'un autre temps qui doivent absolument disparaître de toutes les zones de la planète. Et je vous remercie de votre attention. Et bon courage à vous tous sur ce combat noble qu'il est nécessaire de gagner dans les meilleurs délais.
Merci beaucoup, M. Vito. Maintenant, je donne la parole à Patricia Toia, membre du Parlement européen, vice-président de la Commission de l'Industrie et de l'Énergie. Patricia, tu as la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tout le monde et bonne journée. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici dans cette conférence en ligne. Nous ayons aussi une longue liste de collègues qui participeront, qui ont déjà participé et participeront avec leur discours. Et cela indique que rien ne peut entaver nos efforts en faveur de la démocratie et des droits de l'homme en Iran, pas même le Covid-19. En Iran, la misogynie domine sur l'ensemble du droit constitutionnel et du système juridique. La répression des femmes en Iran a toujours été une préoccupation des parlementaires européens de ce Parlement. Elles ont été, cette femme, systématiquement réprimées par le régime clérical qui dirige l'Iran. Elles ont été privées, plus que des autres citoyennes iraniennes, de tous leurs droits humains. Elles ont tellement souffert de l'apartheid sexuel pratiqué par le régime des mullahs que le taxe de suicide des femmes en Iran est l'une des plus hautes élevées du monde. Et ça est une question qui nous doit faire réfléchir beaucoup. Dans leur activité politique, elles ont subi le plus haut degré de torture et de mauvais traitements. Même des femmes enceintes ont été exécutées par ce régime, et ça c'est horrible. Ce sont des femmes qui ont le plus souffert, ce sont les femmes qui ont le plus souffert par le régime pendant le Covid-19. Selon les informations obtenues par les organisations internationales, 9 prisonnières ont été contaminées à la prison de Tabriz et aussi des autres prisons, on a eu cette contamination. Mais je suis heureuse quand même de dire qu'aucune de ces souffrances n'a rendu les femmes iraniennes frustrées et désespérées. Aucune de ces souffrances. On peut les voir en première ligne dans les manifestations et les soulèvements contre les régimes en Iran. Elles encouragent les autres à rompre le silence et à exprimer leur mécontentement. Les voix féminines dominent dans toutes les manifestations. Les femmes sont partout, où il faut du courage pour se lever et crier contre la dictature. Mais pourquoi? Parce qu'elles ont des modèles dont elles peuvent s'inspirer. En Iran, il y a un mouvement de résistance. Le mouvement de résistance avec lequel nous parlons aujourd'hui est dirigé par une femme, Mariam Rajavi, que je respecte beaucoup. Je la connais et je l'estime. Je l'ai rencontrée plusieurs fois ici au Parlement européen avec mes collègues. Mariam Rajavi, je vais l'appeler avec son nom principal, Mariam, a mis en pratique tous ces idéaux sur l'égalité des sexes. Elle, c'est une femme d'un courage, d'une persévérance extraordinaire, qui est une source d'inspiration pour tous les Iraniennes, en particulier les femmes, qui inspirent à la liberté, aux droits humains, à la démocratie, à la justice sociale et surtout à la légalité des sexes. Je veux dire qu'elle est une inspiration aussi pour nous femmes qui vivons dans des pays où les droits sont respectés, mais elle est une inspiration aussi pour nous, pour son courage. Son combat acharné depuis des années est le prix son mouvement a payé dans la lutte pour la liberté du peuple iranien nous encourage à soutenir ses efforts en faveur de la démocratie et des droits de l'homme en Iran. Le dernier en date d'étend son appel à une mission d'enquête internationale indépendante pour visiter les prisons iraniennes de la haute commissaire des droits de l'homme de l'ONU à d'agir en conséquence. Comme des élus européens, nous devons mettre les valeurs européennes comme la démocratie et les droits de l'homme en premier plan dans nos politiques vers les pays tiers. C'est pour cela que je pense qu'au-delà de tout point de vue politique qui existe sur l'Iran aujourd'hui, au-delà de nos différentes positions politiques, nous devons ensemble prioriser les droits de l'homme et la démocratie au lieu des intérêts économiques, des intérêts des différentes parties. Cela pour nous aider à réunir sur la politique correcte sur l'Iran pour parler d'une voix. Et nous sommes prêts à le faire. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Patricia. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à un membre du Parlement européen, aussi de l'Italie, à Alessandra Moretti.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, friends of to discuss with you such a crucial and important issue. In the Stockholm Declaration drafted by Amnesty International in 1977, we read, when the state uses its power to end the life of a human being, it is likely that no other right is inviolate. The state cannot give life, it should not presume to take it away. More than 40 years have passed, and in Iran, the violation of basic human rights and crimes against humanity have not stopped. The same violations and crimes that have been condemned by the United Nations 66 times. The situation in Iran is catastrophic. Iran is the first country for executions in the world. In 2019, there have been 251 death sentences that we know of, accounting for 38% of all executions in the world. Among these, we cannot forget the great number of minors and women who were sent to death. We cannot forget that last year, 13 of these capital sentences were executed in public. We cannot forget the reasons that lead to the conviction of many innocent people. We cannot forget the iniquity of the trials and the illegality of the detentions. We cannot forget that many prisoners were not allowed to meet with the families and with the lawyers before being killed. We cannot forget that men, women, and children have been tortured and fustigated. We cannot forget what happened to the 30,000 political prisoners who were massacred in 1988, and the fact that the perpetrators have not been punished yet. We cannot forget the death of the 1,500 Pacific protesters that this past November were fighting for their freedom. We cannot forget the recent and terrible execution of the Iranian wrestling champion, Navid Afkari, as we cannot forget the sacrifices made by many young women who lost their lives trying to obtain what we consider basic rights. I want to remind you the recent passing of Sara Kodari, who set herself on fire in front of the court that wanted to punish her for entering a football stadium, or the death of the famous lawyer Nasrin Soudeh, who was sentenced to 33 years of reclusion and 158 lashes as she was fighting against the death penalty. We should not forget neither Narges Mohammadi, convicted for the same reason and forced in a cell even when presenting severe COVID symptoms. We cannot and we must not forget. Need I remind you of the conditions in which women have to live? They are not allowed to do things that we in Europe take for granted. Girls cannot sing or dance, cannot ride a bicycle, cannot choose how to dress and whether wear the hijab or not. They cannot travel alone, they cannot go to the stadium, if not only recently to see the matches of the national team. They cannot choose who to marry and when. In the penal code, violence against women for gender motives, domestic abuse, and coercive and early weddings are not recognized as crimes. During Rouhani office, 108 women have been executed and many have been sentenced to the long reclusion in prison, in which there is no respect of the individual and systematic cruelty is perpetrated on a daily basis. Our fight for the death penalty abolition is not only concerned with the savings of life, based on the strong belief that the right to the life and the respect for human dignity should be universal, but it has to do also with the terrible conditions in which prisoners have to live. Women are forced to stay in overcrowded prisons, being subject to ill treatments and with a scarce access to health care and medical treatments, a condition that has even worsened due to the recent COVID outbreak. On this matter, I want to highlight the firm position we took in July when some members of the European Parliament and I presented a letter to the Vice President of the European Commission, Joseph Borrell, asking for an immediate change in the chair's conditions and for the release of the prisoner, especially the unrightfully committed human rights defenders. Not less, we will keep following with this close attention how the situation develops, and we won't rest until the prisoners are respected. As I've already said, we cannot forget, and we won't. Europe cannot accept such cruelties and violations of the rights we long fought for and on which our society is founded. The impunity of the perpetrators of such offences is not tolerable, and thus I respectfully call on the High Representative to change it. EU can do more in the fight for human rights of the Iranian people. It should initiate an independent fact-finding mission into these crimes. I declare my full support for the viable democratic alternative for a fundamental change, and I support Madame Rajani's 10-point plan for a free and democratic Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for this very vigorous speech. And now it's my pleasure, c'est mon plaisir de donner la parole à l'ancien ministre de l'Intérieur, de la Justice, des Affaires étrangères et de la Défense de la France, et membre du Parlement européen, Michel Alliot-Marie.
La présidente Mariam Rajavi m'a demandé de m'exprimer une nouvelle fois devant vous sur la situation en Iran. Je le fais volontiers parce que depuis maintenant des années que je connais Mariam Rajavi, j'apprécie sa détermination, sa constance, sa sincérité dans la défense de valeurs qui sont aussi les miennes. Les valeurs de la liberté d'aller et de venir, la liberté de parole, la liberté de penser, la liberté de voter, sa défense aussi de la démocratie, qui permet que les relations entre les hommes et les femmes dans un pays se fassent sur une base libre et égalitaire, sa défense des droits des femmes. Aujourd'hui, le monde entier prend conscience d'un certain nombre de contraintes qui pèsent sur les femmes et tout le monde se mobilise pour permettre à chacune de vivre plus librement, de faire ses choix, de se sentir bien. C'est un élément important dans la vie. Et Mariam Rajavi en fait un des éléments de son programme. C'est la défense des droits de l'homme également, qui est au cœur des préoccupations que nous avons tous. C'est la défense de la laïcité. Et dans une période où il y a trop de tensions dans les différents pays entre les religions, je pense qu'il est important de défendre ce mode de vie en commun qui laisse la religion dans le secteur privé. Je réponds aussi volontiers à la demande de Madame Rajavi de m'exprimer sur l'Iran, parce que l'Iran est à mes yeux un très grand pays. Son histoire, sa culture, lui ont donné de tout temps un rôle important dans la région. Et je suis persuadée que dans les années à venir, l'Iran pourrait, à condition d'appliquer un certain nombre de principes, retrouver ce rôle de stabilisation et d'établissement de la paix dans une région qui est extrêmement instable et dans un monde qui subit de multiples contraintes. Nous le voyons encore avec la crise du Covid. Je déplore effectivement ce qui se passe aujourd'hui en Iran et qui est en contradiction avec les valeurs auxquelles j'adhère, les valeurs qui sont celles aussi de l'Union européenne. Et de ce point de vue, je regrette sincèrement que les instances européennes qui font des valeurs de liberté, de démocratie, de laïcité, le socle de leurs actions, soient trop silencieuses devant des actes qui sont des actes en contradiction avec ces valeurs et des actes qui sont finalement inacceptables. Certes, je le sais bien, le principe de non-ingérence est une des bases de notre conception des relations internationales. Il est évident que c'est aux Iraniens eux-mêmes de décider ce que doit être le régime qui préside aux destinées de l'Iran, ce que doivent être leurs gouvernants. Mais pour autant, il nous revient aussi à nous de dénoncer un certain nombre de choses inacceptables. Les exécutions capitales, alors que nous sommes contre la peine de mort, les tortures, les emprisonnements arbitraires et même les tentatives d'action terroriste, y compris sur le territoire européen. J'ai eu l'occasion de le dire au cours de ma dernière intervention, que des diplomates soient interpellés par la police en Belgique pour la préparation d'actions terroristes, c'est une première et c'est quelque chose que d'un point de vue de la politique internationale autant que de la morale, nous ne pouvons accepter. Alors, pour avoir été parlementaire européen, je sais qu'il y a un certain nombre de débats, mais moi ce qui me frappe toujours, c'est de voir que, en ce qui concerne des actions inacceptables commises en Iran, il y a beaucoup moins de condamnations et des condamnations beaucoup moins fortes que celles que l'on peut avoir pour des actes qui y ressemblent et qui sont commis dans d'autres pays. Alors aujourd'hui, et je le dis devant, je le sais, des parlementaires européens, je pense qu'il est indispensable que soient réellement condamnés ces agissements par les différentes instances européennes, et il est également indispensable que l'on en tire des conséquences concrètes.
Merci, cher Michel Alliot-Marie. Votre soutien et votre présence aux côtés de la résistance iranienne est très important, et spécialement votre soutien de la liberté et la démocratie en Iran. Vous envoyez un signal fort à l'Europe que la politique de complaisance n'aboutit à rien et la seule solution est la fermeté et soutenir le peuple iranien qui souffre. Je suis sûre qu'un jour, le peuple iranien pourra être libre dans le pays. Et c'est un jour très important, non seulement pour le peuple iranien, et aussi pour le peuple au Moyen-Orient, et aussi pour la paix et la sécurité dans le monde. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the member of the European Parliament from Czech Republic, Stanislav Polčák.
Madam President, dear colleagues, it's an honor to speak in this conference to discuss situation in Iran and our Union policy on Iran. We usually deal with the human rights violations and terrorist activities of the Iranian regime as two separate issues, whereas the two are two sides of the same coin. The view and approach that allows the regime suppress peaceful protests of the people, killing more than 1,500 of them and arresting and torturing thousands of them in November 2019, is the same view and approach that allows it to plot the bombing of the gathering of 100,000 people in Villepinte near Paris to kill many innocent people. The regime is doing all this for one reason only, for its own survival. Many of the regime's so-called diplomats have been involved in terrorist plots and were always able to get away with their crimes. But now, for the first time in the field of terrorism, its diplomat has been arrested. An action diplomat would never plan this plot without approval of the top leadership of the regime. While the judicial proceedings are underway independent of any political influence, well, it is time for High Representative of the EU and the governments in Europe to end business as usual with this regime. The regime in Iran must be accountable for such crimes in Europe. Anything less would be given to state terrorism. The European Union must respect its own values, democratic principles. We have been criticizing the EU policy on Iran in European Parliament for more than 1 decade. Today, appeasement with this brutal regime is against the security of Europe. The EU must stand with the Iranian people and their democratic alternative, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. In my years in the European Parliament, I have always maintained close relations with Iranian resistance. Even before that, when I was a member of the Czech Parliament, I came to Paris events and met Madame Rajavi on many occasions. So you can count on my continued support until we have freedom and democracy in Iran. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to a very good friend, the member of the European Parliament from Spain, Herman Tertsch.
Hello to you, hello to everybody. I am Herman Tertsch. I am speaking from Brussels, from the Parliament, and I want to send my best regards to the conference of the Friends of Free Iran. I think it's very important that in this year we have another gathering for searching in ways in the fight for creating these spaces of liberty in Iran that we strongly need to get rid of a criminal regime which is again showing the worst face and the incapability of every way of having a human treatment of the population, of the Iranian population. 40 years now of tyrannical regime of the mullahs, and there's no improvement in the lives of the Iranians, and there is no glimpse of freedom. We had just in November last year, we had the last monstrous expression of the repression of the regime. Over 1,500 young Iranians fall in the streets of the cities in Iran, asking for freedom, asking for having dignity, and for having the rights that all citizens of the world should have, and rights which are defended from here, from Europe. That's why Europe has to be, and that's one of our commitments in Vox and ECR, our commitment of having a Europe far more belligerent in defending the rights of the Iranians and in fighting against the regime of the mullahs. We don't want any appeasement, which is so dear to some forces here in this parliament. We want no appeasement with this dictatorship, with this tyrannical regime in Tehran. We want a very resolute search for an end of this regime and for a peaceful and democratic Iran in the future. That's the right of Iranians, and that is a right which we have the plight and we are for an end of this regime and for a peaceful and democratic Iran in the future. That's the right of Iranians, and that is a right which we have the plight and we are obliged to fight for it here in Europe and all over the democratic West. Thank you, everybody, for your commitment in this fight for democratic Iran. And let's keep together, because the fight is going on.
Thank you very much, Herman. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to another good friend of mine, Javier Zarzalejos, member of the European Parliament and former Secretary General of the Prime Minister Office in Spain. Javier, the floor is yours.
Dear Mrs. Rajavi, distinguished guests and friends from around the world, I salute you from the European Parliament. On the occasion of the 18th World Day against the death penalty, I would like to express my deep commitment against death penalty worldwide. I would like to convey to you, once again, my support so that the Iranian regime puts an end to the persistent violations of human rights, and most significantly to the death penalty that the regime uses as a way of systematically wiping out the political opposition. Let me tell you that even speaking of death penalty in this context seems inappropriate to me, because it's not a penalty, it is sheer state murder. So far this year, the Rouhani regime has executed 198 people. A few days ago, the international community was shocked by the execution of the 27-year-old Iranian Navid Afkari. My thoughts are with the political prisoners who are currently subject to torture, forced confessions, and sentenced to death. In this regard, I would like to mention especially Atena Daemi, Zara Safaye, and Masumed Senovari, among the several female political prisoners whose lives are in danger. Again, I take this opportunity to commend the work of the democratic opposition and guarantee you that the European Union does indeed listen to the plight of the Iranian people.
Thank you very much, Javier. And now I give the floor to the member of the European Parliament from Germany, Lars Patrick Berg.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, I am honored to say a few words today, particularly since Iran has the highest executions per capita. I was appalled to hear that the mullahs regime executed the young Iranian national sports hero Navid Afkari, despite so many protests and pleas by political leaders and sports figures from all around the world. Many German athletes, sports champions and lawmakers joined the call to stop executions in Iran. Now, several other pro-democracy protesters have been sentenced to death and could be executed any time from now. I urge that this trend of executions stop. Wanting freedom is not a crime. This total disregard for human life is outrageous. Until now, as the Iranian opposition has stated, 108 women have been executed by the regime since Hassan Rouhani has been in power. The use of the death sentence for political purposes must be stopped, and such medieval practices must cease. This behavior has no place in the 21st century. It is time for action by the world's democratic governments. Words of condemnation are not enough. We need concrete actions. We in Europe must show to the Iranian people that we support their fight for freedom and democracy and continue to urge the international community to bring pressure on the unrepresentative regime of the mullahs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to the member of the European Parliament from Slovenia, Frank Bogovic.
Dear Mr. Rajavi, dear colleagues, my name is Franz Bogovic, member of the European Parliament from Slovenia. It's an honor to join our distinguished colleagues to address the serious concern with regards to Iran. I agree with what my other colleagues said today and support their call for a firm policy on Iran, especially the need to recognize and support the Iranian people and their popular resistance movement, the NCRI, in their quest for a free and democratic Iran, including Mr. Rajavi's 10 points plan for the free Iran, which symbolize all that is needed for a democratic country. Even as we are from different parties, we are united in the fact that the EU must adopt a firm policy on Iran that holds the regime to account for its terrorism and human rights abuses. For me, one of the immediate serious concerns is the expiring arms embargo in Iran, which will allow the regime to legally buy weapons from China and Russia and allow Tehran to export weapons to its terrorist proxies across the Middle East. Allowing the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and world's leading state executor per capita legal access to conventional and sophisticated weapons will not only be a threat to the people of Iran and the stability in the region, but also a serious threat to the security of Europe. That is why I joined over 250 parliamentarians from European and Arab countries in supporting a statement on Iran earlier September that urged the European and Arab governments to work together and extend the arms embargo in Iran and support the snapback of all UN sanctions under UN Security Council Resolution 2231. The EU is seriously concerned about Iran's malignant role in the region and the domestic crackdown on protesters. But words will not stop or counter the regime in Iran. Action will. The EU must now take concrete action based on these concerns. The best way for the EU leaders and the European governments to do that is by denying the regime the resources and funds it needs through reimposing UN sanctions and extend arms embargo. This must be the focus on the EU in the coming weeks and months, and the Iran regime will only be persuaded by firm actions and not by hollow condemnation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Franz. And now I give the floor to a member of the European Parliament from Sweden, David Lega.
Friends, for me, as the rapporteur of the EPP group on Iran, it is a pleasure to speak in this conference on the human rights situation in Iran. It is the very injustices, the human rights abuses that the Iranian regime commits against its own people that brings us all together today. I will spend a few minutes talking about that, about the actions of the leaders in Iran. If the regime seek to recover respect from their people and from the world, if they seek stability and prosperity for a once great nation, they must respect the commitments that they have made. They must respect human rights. Article 14 of the Iranian constitution says that the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran and all Muslims are duty-bound to treat non-Muslims in conformity with ethical norms and to respect their human rights. Their human rights must be respected. And while Article 27 of the Constitution allows for public gatherings and marches, the regime just won't let their citizens speak up. The Iranian regime is desperate to control speech, to control ideas, and indeed to control life itself. And the protests in Iran signals that the Iranian people have had enough. They have had enough with the regime's economic failures. They have had enough with the kleptocrats. And they have had enough with a regime that denies them basic fundamental human dignity that comes from each of us as a nature of our humanity. Despite the critical situation of the pandemic, Iran has continued to carry out executions of prisoners and still refuses to release prisoners, particularly prisoners of conscience, as sanitary conditions have proven to be alarming and threatening. The regime has launched a large-scale arrest of its opponents and has suppressed its democratic opposition, which reports daily on the situation of corona in the country. And I am gravely concerned over the ill treatment and torture of those who have been arrested. Over the past 2 years, a large number of prisoners arrested in protests have been murdered while in custody. And in almost all cases, Iranian authorities claimed that the prisoners had committed suicide. That is the utmost opposite of human dignity. The death penalty is unacceptable under all circumstances and cases, with no exception. It is an inhumane punishment and represents denial of human dignity and integrity. The European Union has condemned the recent executions in the strongest terms. But more action is required. Inaction is counterproductive and will be misconstrued by Iran as a green light from your European Union vis-à-vis Tehran's egregious human rights abuses. EU relations with Iran cannot tolerate anything less than a halt to executions and clear progress on human rights. That being said, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today, and I welcome you, friends of a free Iran, to contact me with inquiries, as I've recently been appointed the EPP Standing and Monitoring Shadow Rapporteur for Iran. Thank you again, and I wish you a fruitful seminar.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting on Iran, and it's a very important issue.
We hear executions continue in Iran. We cannot accept this. We also seen how the regime has launched a brutal crackdown against popular protests demanding change and freedom, which take place frequently in Iran since 2018. We hear their demand to get rid of this corrupt regime, but what is the EU really doing to help them? We cannot continue business as usual with such a state. Soft words to such a regime when we know they are killing anyone who expresses discontent or opposition. This is not the EU. EU should say, or you end this barbaric treatment or we don't have anything to do with you. We have today evidence that Iran's state terrorism has reached European soil. One Iranian diplomat, Asadullah Assadi, is to be prosecuted next month in Belgium for his involvement in the bombing of the gathering of Iran's pro-democracy opposition in Paris on June 2018. We also know about other activities in other European countries. Assadi was put in the EU terror list just recently, but it is not enough. We need to ensure that the regime does not continue such harmful activities on European soil. This is the direct result of the policy of appeasement and sanction relief pursued by the EU, which culminated in the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that essentially left Europe paralyzed in face of Iran's growing destabilizing activities, terrorism and domestic repression. So the time has come for the EU and its member states to revise and alter this appeasement policy in favor of a firm policy toward Iran, because like any other dictator in history, Iran's regime only understands the language of firmness. This firm policy should hold the regime to account for its terrorism in Europe and domestic repression through sanctions and downgrading diplomatic relations. EU must even consider closing Iran's embassies because the regime is using its diplomatic missions to carry out espionage and terrorist plots against Iranian dissidents and activists in a state-sanctioned effort to silence all opposition, no matter where they are, as popular protests against the regime grow across Iran.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to a member of the European Parliament from Lithuania, Petras Auštrevičius.
Over the last 4 decades, the present regime in Iran has committed many crimes against humanity, breaching human rights, disrespecting citizens' rights, and opposing opponents. That's the way the mullahs regime trying to sustain situation in Iran. International crimes should be added. The recent execution of Navid Afterzi, a champion, was one more case when mullahs were trying to scare people, to show what might be awaiting others if they raise their voice and they stand for human rights. The United Nations should send monitoring mission to Iran as soon as possible. We have to monitor the situation, we have to report, and we have to defend human rights in Iran, standing with Iranian people.
Human rights. Iran, under the mullahs' rule, is one of the world's most egregious human rights abusers. No less than 120,000 political opponents have perished, and hundreds of thousands imprisoned and tortured. In the summer of 1988 alone, 30,000 political prisoners were hanged in a matter of a few months based on a fatwa by Khomeini. None had been sentenced to death. Their only crime? Allegiance to the Mojahedin-e-Khalq, MEK, or opposition to the regime. Years of impunity emanating from a policy of appeasement has emboldened the mullahs to double down on rights abuses. Perpetrators of the 1988 massacre now occupy the most senior executive and judicial posts, including the judiciary chief, the justice minister, and so forth. The security forces shot dead more than 1,500 protesters during the nationwide November 2019 uprising. Some 12,000 detained during the protests are undergoing torture despite the spread of coronavirus in the prisons. Fearful of another uprising, the regime has sentenced several prisoners to death and hanged two. Mustafa Salehi, a father of two small children, and Iran's wrestling champion Navid Ifkhari, despite an international outcry to stop his execution. Amnesty International issued a scathing report on the treatment of those arrested. The EU should demand that independent international fact-finding missions visit Iran's prisons and meet the prisoners, especially political prisoners. The EU and its member states must unequivocally condemn the ongoing human rights abuses and predicate any political and commercial ties on a halt in executions and torture. The EU should call for an independent inquiry into the 1988 prison massacre and include a paragraph on the subject in the upcoming UN General Assembly censure resolution of the human rights situation in Iran.
Thank you for this very revealing video clip. Our next speaker is the member of the European Parliament, Radka Maxová from the Czech Republic.
Dear colleagues, the human rights situation in Iran is very worrying, and what is worse is that the violations are ongoing. Women are the first targets of this regime despite the persistent attack on their fundamental rights. Iran women keep courageously fighting the regime. We saw it in the protests last year, where 1,500 protesters were killed last November, including 400 women. Many protesters were arrested and are right now in terrible conditions imprisoned. We have debated on many occasions at the European Parliament the need to end violence and suppression in Iran, and now with the news coming from Iran of all the execution and death sentences, serious action is needed. The Iranian regime cannot continue to violate the human rights of its own Iranian people. The EU should strongly oppose the autocratic government that violates fundamental rights of its citizens and should use its political and economic powers to help the opposition. I would like to thank all of you, and especially Ms. Rajavi, for your tireless efforts for a democratic and free Iran. We stand with you and the Iranian people in your aspiration for democracy, and we hope that 4 decades of suffering will end very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radka. And our next speaker is the member of the European Parliament from Italy, Anna Bonfisco.
Grazie per l'invito, amici della Resistenza iraniana. Tenevo particolarmente a intervenire al vostro incontro, anche se con un video, proprio in occasione della giornata mondiale contro la pena di morte. La violazione dei diritti basilari, i diritti umani, dei principi di libertà da parte dei regimi autoritari non può mai essere derubricato come un affare interno del paese. Deve obbligatoriamente riguardare ed interessare tutti gli altri, cittadini, governi e parlamenti. E su questo il coronavirus ci ha dimostrato quanto siamo interconnessi e quanto quegli affari interni di un paese sono anche affari di tutti gli altri. Quanti contagi, quanti morti, quanti tamponi in Iran. Non avremmo mai dato certi. Se avessimo saputo tempestivamente cosa stava accadendo in Cina agli inizi dell'anno, avremmo reagito prima e meglio a quella che poi è diventata una pandemia. Credo proprio di sì. Io da parlamentare sono preoccupata, ma anche occupata a combattere il silenzio opportunista di molti governi europei, tra cui quello italiano, che sembrano anteporre gli interessi politici ed economici a quelli del popolo oppresso. Da cittadina sono turbata profondamente nel vedere un grande popolo come quello iraniano, impotente rispetto alle barbarie perpetrate contro gli oppositori politici o contro chiunque agisca o pensi in modo differente da quanto considerato lecito dal regime. Vanno aiutati dall'esterno coloro che invece hanno la forza di alzare la testa e di protestare all'interno. La pressione mediatica, di opinione e soprattutto quella politica dovrebbe essere costante e non intervenire solo come mezzo di censura nei confronti di esecuzioni eclatanti e vergognose, come quella ultima di Navid Afkari, il pugile arrestato e condannato a morte perché aveva con tanti altri partecipato a manifestazioni di protesta. O come l'avvocatessa che si occupava di diritti umani, Nasrin Sotoudeh, ce la ricordiamo tutti, condannata a 38 anni di carcere e 150 frustate senza aver avuto, tra l'altro, il diritto di una vera e propria difesa nel processo. Ora versa in gravissime condizioni in ospedale per uno sciopero della fame, una forma di lotta estrema e non violenta per reagire al recente arresto anche di sua figlia, poco più che ventenne. Cari amici iraniani che assistete impotenti da qui, in Europa, a queste drammatiche ingiustizie perpetrate contro il vostro popolo, voglio dirvi che non siete soli. Il vostro paese ha una peculiarità invidiabile che potrebbe davvero giocare un ruolo determinante nella lotta al regime. I vostri giovani, che rappresentano la maggioranza degli 80 milioni di abitanti. Da qui abbiamo il dovere, ognuno secondo il proprio ruolo e le proprie responsabilità, di aiutare in ogni modo, soprattutto approfittando di internet e dei social media, i giovani iraniani a riprendersi il proprio futuro, fatto di libertà e di rispetto dei diritti.
Thank you very much. And now I call to the floor to a member of the European Parliament from Poland and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Anna Fotyga.
Dear Iranian friends, greetings from the European Parliament. I'm very sorry not being able to participate in person in your important conference. I just wanted to say and send this message to show my concern for the situation of ordinary people of Iran. Almost exactly 1 year ago, in the course of mass protests of Iranian people, we were able in the parliament to debate the violent actions taken by the regime of mullahs against its own people. And European Parliament, by majority of MEPs, condemned actions taken against people, affecting in many deaths, imprisonment of thousands of people. The whole situation was exacerbated by eruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular in Iran, with the poor state of healthcare, but also by really dreadful conditions of political prisoners in prisons.
It was real disaster, and people felt it deeply. We stay by ordinary people. We want to support them on our daily activities in the European Parliament. We try to stay in touch by people of Iran and show our solidarity. It is extremely important for the civil society of the country to find their way to show strength, to enable people taking care of their own country. It is in the interest of whole international society, and therefore we support requests for changes in Iran, for respect human rights, to respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to give people their citizens' rights and possibility to live peacefully, to abandon death penalty, in particular death penalty against minors, because actually in many cases it is common situation in Iraq and in Iran, sorry, and people face this disastrous development of events. We would also like Iran to see the prosperous economic development, enabling many ordinary small-scale traders to benefit from riches of the country, from raw materials and producing capabilities Iran has. Unfortunately, after introduction of JCPOA and defreezing of funds, the financing possibilities were limited to upper echelons of society, preventing ordinary people from benefiting of this development. I think that we have to stay firm, that we have to expose the atrocities of mullah regime, in particular the attitudes vis-à-vis political prisoners and the attitude vis-à-vis women, minors, and also citizens of dual citizenship, because persecution was common experience also of many Europeans of Iranian origin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Fotika, for your speech. I would like again to extend my congratulations to you on your re-election as Secretary General of the ECR party, as well as your recent appointment by the NATO Secretary General to the Committee on the NATO Reflection Process. You have always supported our movement because you are committed to the value of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Mrs. Rajavi. Our next speaker is a very good friend, personal friend, and also a very good friend of the Iranian resistance, former member of the European Parliament from Estonia, Tune Kelam.
Friends, colleagues, Madame Rajavi, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. Indeed, we have come a long way together with PMOI. As an MEP, I joined the Friends of Free Iran group about 16 years ago and served as one of its vice presidents. We had the opportunity to observe and support your fight, to clear the PMOI name in the European Court, pave your way to the European Parliament, and participate in your various activities. My most memorable impression was visiting the first Ashraf camp 12 years ago, together with Alejo Vidal-Quadras and 2 other colleagues. My last visit to newborn Ashraf III was in November 2018, where we met with Madame Rajavi. The creativity, morals, sincerity and determination of the Ashraf residents have convinced me that you will overcome. Today, this change is nearer than any time before, and therefore it is crucial to realize that democratic countries are part of the solution. In fact, they bear direct responsibility for the continuation of Tehran's inhuman and aggressive dictatorship. Western ambiguity, pragmatic economic interests and double standards are helping to prolong the mullahs' bloody rule. We need to realize that every additional day of this regime means new arrests, new executions and new suppression. It is high time to conclude that the 2015 nuclear deal has failed the expectations that were cherished in the West. It has shown that the Tehran regime has absolutely no intention of meeting its commitments or to become more humane. On the contrary, mullahs have used the deal to gather strength and intensify their aggression across the Middle East. Today, it has become clear that only a regime change can make Iran a normal, friendly and nuclear-free country. Madame Rajavi's 10-point program is the only realistic way to achieve this goal. There's no other scenario to solve Iran's problem, internally as well as externally. The change in Iran is a sovereign right of the Iranians, but it can be advanced by the change of EU's policy. As a former MEP, I am disappointed that the EU policy has been kept appeasing the mullahs despite so many horrific crimes. The EU has mostly looked aside or just paid lip service in reacting to these crimes. We must react not by whispering our concern, but by concrete actions. We must impose sanctions on this regime for their human rights breaches or risk losing EU's own credibility. We must recall our ambassadors, if needed, from Tehran to protest the regime's inhuman behavior. The EU has to demand unhindered access to Iran's prisons, especially to the prisoners held since November last year's protests. Iranian nation is clearly fed up with a ruling theocracy. This is proven by people's widespread and continuing uprising, by the slogans, for example, down with dictator, be it Shah or the supreme religious leader. The people of Iran want a free and peaceful country. They deserve the right and dignity to be restored. Therefore, it is a duty of every citizen of the free world, especially politicians, to support the Iranian people's aspirations for democracy and freedom. Let us keep working together to that end and be sure that I will continue to stand with you until the day that Iran will be free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Kella. Thank you for your strong speech. You talked about your visit to Ashraf I and Ashraf III, and they resolved to overthrow the mullahs' dictatorship and establish freedom of Iran. I'm sure this is within reach. And thank you very much, Mr. Vidal Quadras.
Now we will watch a short clip about terrorism by the Iranian regime.
On June 30th, 2018, Belgium authorities the Iranian regime tried to truck bomb the annual New Year celebration of MEK members in Tirana, Albania, where thousands of its members reside. The National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, President-elect Mrs. Rajavi and Rudy Giuliani were to address the event. Tehran had dispatched 2 Iranians posing as journalists to plan the attack, who were arrested there by foiling the plot. Albania subsequently expelled the Iranian ambassador and the intelligence station chief for their role in the terror plot. On June 30th, 2018, Belgium authorities foiled a major terrorist plot by arresting a hit team in Brussels, en route to Villepinte, north of Paris, to plant a bomb at the annual gathering in support of the NCRI, in which 100,000 Iranians and hundreds of international dignitaries took part. Another terrorist was arrested at the venue. Mrs. Rajavi was the primary target. The next day, a senior Iranian diplomat in Vienna, Asadollah Asadi, was arrested in Germany trying to return to Vienna from Luxembourg, where he had personally handed over the explosives to the terrorist agents. He was the intelligence ministry station chief at the embassy since 2014. The Supreme National Security Council, headed by Hassan Rouhani, decided to carry out this major terrorist operation, which was approved by the regime's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The plot came after the major nationwide anti-regime uprisings in Iran in December 2017 and January 2018 that shook the regime to its foundations. In January 2018, Khamenei had underscored the role of the MEK and its network in leading the uprising. In October 2018, the French Interior, Foreign and Economy Minister said in a joint statement, "Without any doubt, responsibility falls on the Iranian Intelligence Ministry, and the Deputy Minister of Intelligence had ordered it." In January 2019, the EU placed part of the Iranian Intelligence Ministry and 2 of its senior officials on its sanctions list. In July 2020, a court in Antwerp, Belgium, upheld the federal prosecutor's indictment against Asadi and his 3 accomplices. Their trial, the first against an accredited diplomat on terrorist charges, is scheduled for November 27, 2020. Reports from the German, Dutch, and other European security agencies confirm that Iran regime's embassies have long been participating actively in terrorism and espionage against the NCRI. Indeed, an EU Council of Ministers declaration issued in April 1997 called for the expulsion of the mullahs intelligence agents from Europe.
And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to a very good personal friend and one of the best friends of the Iranian resistance, the former member of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom, Struan Stevenson.
Thank you for your great words today. 60 million Iranians are now living below the international poverty line. A grinding privation and penury
has driven people to sell their livers, their kidneys, and even the corneas for cash. Sick organ traders are exploiting the poor to rake in huge profits. The Iranian currency, the rial, is in free fall. It's lost 49% of its value so far this year as the US ramps up economic pressure with renewed sanctions. Iran, as one of the world's leading oil and gas producers, now has one of the world's most worthless currencies, with hyperinflation topping 34.4% annually. But 41 years of venal corruption, dim-witted incompetence, and brutal oppression by the fascist Iranian government has brought this once prosperous and successful nation to its knees. Revolution is in the air. When the theocratic regime announced a massive threefold hike in gasoline prices in November 2019, millions of poor Iranians took to the streets in protest. And of course, the mullahs' predictable reaction was to order their Gestapo, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, and their internal security thugs, the Basij, to brutally suppress the nationwide uprising. Black-clad and masked IRGC snipers gunned down unarmed protesters from the rooftops of government buildings, shooting to kill. Basij goons beat young demonstrators with batons. 1,500 protesters were killed. Thousands more were wounded. The IRGC dragged injured protesters from their hospital beds. They were taken to specially prepared torture centers where many perished. Over 12,000 were arrested and thrown into the regime's medieval prisons. Dozens have been sentenced to death for daring to challenge the authority of the fascist dictatorship. The execution of political prisoners has become almost a daily event, as the so-called moderate President Hassan Rouhani, in his absurd speech to the UN General Assembly, proclaimed that, in his words, political freedom at home is very important to us. He said, as the most ancient democracy in the Middle East, we are proud of our democracy and we will not compromise our freedoms with foreign intervention. You know, his pathological lies have fooled no one inside Iran. The seething resentment and antipathy to the clerical regime has begun to boil over. Poverty-stricken Iranians are appalled that their government continues to pour money and military personnel into Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad's bloody civil war. They are horrified that the mullahs are funneling endless Iranian cash to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the vicious Shia militias in Iraq. They are shocked to learn that vast resources are being channeled into the secret production of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, despite Rouhani's international denials. And they're dismayed that corruption and incompetence has seen the death toll from COVID-19 soar to over 116,000 nationwide. Resistance units of the main democratic opposition movement, the People's Mujahideen Organization, the PMOI, MEK, have been formed in every town and city in the country. Sporadic outbursts of anger and protests against the regime have occurred daily, with defiant youths torching and vandalizing regime-affiliated sites. As we've heard repeatedly, the execution of the young wrestling champion Navid Afkari, despite a global campaign to stop his judicial murder, has sparked renewed fury across the nation. His hanging outraged young Iranians who regarded Afkari as a sporting hero. young resistance fighters have attacked courthouses, government buildings, and IRGC and besieged bases in towns and cities throughout Iran. A center for promoting fundamentalist Islam was torched in the city of Karaj. Banners, posters, and images of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and of the terrorist IRGC Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani, the man who was killed by a drone strike in January. These banners and posters have been repeatedly targeted and set on fire by protesters. Marchers and street protests routinely chant slogans such as "The Supreme Leader's end is near" and "Rise up to avenge Navid's execution." Anti-regime slogans and messages from the Iranian resistance leader Masoud Rajavi and President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, Mariam Rajavi, regularly appear on walls and hoardings. As resistance to the mullahs continues to grow across Iran, there are increasing demands for the international community to end their policy of appeasement and show their support for the Iranian people. The ongoing torture and execution of political prisoners is a crime against humanity and continues because the United Nations has singularly failed to hold the mullahs regime to account for the massacre of over 30,000 political prisoners, mostly supporters of the PMOI MEK in 1988. Although there is irrefutable evidence of this horrendous crime, which even senior figures in the regime openly admit and boast about, no one has yet been indicted for this horror, one of the worst cases of genocide of the late 20th century. The revolution is coming, and when it comes, the mullahs will face justice, and those in the international community who have sought to appease them will be held answerable and shamed in the court of public opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. Thank you for your very strong speech. I'm sure that the mullahs will be outraged to hear your speech, as well as the speeches of our other friends, and because they will understand you are all determined against mullahs regime everywhere and every time. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Struan. And our next speaker is another very, very good friend of the Iranian resistance and also a very good personal friend. I am referring to former member of the European Parliament, Paolo Casaca, great expert in Middle East policy and Southeast Asia policy, founder of the intergroup Friends of Iran in the European Parliament. Paolo, we listen to you.
Dear Alejo, dear Struan, it is really a great pleasure to see you. Although at a distance, Tuna, it's also very good to see you there. Dear Madam President Rajavi, delighted to listen to your assessment of the situation on Iran. And as we are about to end our conference, I would like to elaborate a bit on one point that I think it's fundamental, the one that was raised actually by at least 3 honorable members of the European Parliament, Benoit Bitreau, Javier Sarsalejos, and Petras Ostrovicius, which is the nature of the crime committed by the Iranian regime that was in evidence with the so-called execution of Navid Afkari. It is absolutely clear that the European Parliament, and to this regard the NCRI as well, it is one of the 10 points, we are fully against death penalty in any circumstance. But as it was said before, what we have seen here with Mr. Afkari was not a death penalty, was a state crime, was an execution that did not even follow the procedures set by the Iranian regime. And actually, this is not the first time. This is not the second. This has been a system that was clearly symbolized by the fatwa of 1988 that ordered the religious supreme leader of the time, the late Ayatollah Khomeini, he ordered the murder of all the political prisoners, the vast majority of them members of the People's Mujahideen of Iran, some that were not, that were on other organizations, but were political opponents, and he ordered their murder. This is, according to the Swiss law, clear a genocide. And I am absolutely delighted to see that although so many years afterwards, the Swiss authorities understood that the murder of Kazem Rajavi is included in this genocide. It was not in 1988, it was 2 years after, but it comes out of the same fatwa. It comes out of the same regime. And the question is, dear members of the European Parliament, that whereas the genocidal leaders of Rwanda that made this horrendous massacre are not in power, they have been some of them brought to trial. The same happened in Cambodia, or even those responsible for the genocide in 1970 in Bangladesh. This has not been the case in Iran. And no one that is truly friend of human rights can rest in peace, can be in peace with himself up to the moment that this genocide is brought to justice. This is a must that we, when we were in the European Parliament, we tried our best to accomplish, but seeing so many European parliamentarians, I am so glad to see that this struggle is going on, and it can never stop. This criminal regime, their responsible people have to be brought to trial for genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo, for your very interesting contribution. And now I call to the floor to the former member of the European Parliament, former Minister of Transport of Finland, our good friend Kimmo Sasi.
Thank you so very much indeed. And Madam Rajavi, dear friends of human rights, I must say Iran is a great country. She has very proud history and excellent culture. And in fact, the country should be very rich because she has a lot of oil, but that's not the truth of today. Today, Iranian people are the hostess of the worst dictatorship in the world of today. Because of the corruption, many people live in hunger, and the country is isolated because it exports terrorism. I think the history shows there's a clear path to prosperity. Europe learned after the World War II that we have to trust in certain values which are democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy, and also the equality between men and women. And if you go on this path, you'll be successful. I understand Iranian people protest today because of the terrible conditions in the country. And that is why the dictatorship in Iran is very afraid. They know what happened in Eastern Europe, late 1980s, when people took the power in their own hands. The Iranian dictatorship is desperate at the moment, and that is why they try to crush their own people. And it's a very bad thing that this means that protesters have been killed, murdered, and many of them sit in the prison at the moment. Navid Afkari's name has been mentioned today several times. And as said, he was hanged a few days ago. And the fact is that Iranian authorities tortured Navid for weeks. In a smuggled letter, he described how for 50 days he was beaten with sticks and batons on his arms, buttocks, and back. And he had a plastic bag over his head until he was almost suffocated. And finally, he was executed. He was murdered. The single case, I think, is a hero of people, and we must. The international community must, at this very moment, must take action against the Iranian dictatorship. What must be done? It is we need economic sanctions. But then when you put economic sanctions, of course, you have to try to take care that there's no black trade that's fueled by the dictatorship and the corruption. Then we need also personal sanctions. There must be sanctions against those people who are leading the country and who have been involved in the murdering of the people. It means their money abroad must be freezed, and if they ever come outside the borders of Iran, so they must be seized and they must be brought into the court of law and they must be sentenced for their crimes. Unfortunately, many Iranian diplomats as well have been engaged with terrorism. And it means the European Union member countries must look how many diplomats Iran can have in their own countries. There must be thorough surveillance. And I think Iran must not have that many diplomats in our countries because of the terrorism. And one thing what the European diplomats must do in Iran is that they must go to the prisons, look after the demonstrators, try to protect them, help them, and make their cases very well known to try to save their lives. And finally, what's very important as well is that there's an investigation to all mass murders. Very important is the murdering of many people in 1988. Those who are guilty must be brought in front of the court. And finally, I must say, there is only one way that can really solve the situation, and that is that the Iranian people take their own fate in their own hands. We need a change of the government, change of the regime in Iran. That is the only durable solution. Thank you. The fight continues.
Let me now say a few words. Now that we are close to the end of this very timely and important conference, it has been indeed an honor for me to speak today at a time when the Iranian people are so bravely and so dangerously seeking justice and fundamental changes in their country. This conference, once again, reminds me of conferences in the past when those happy times where COVID was not with us and we could host and welcome Mrs. Rajavi in the parliament and listen to her personally, to her very inspiring speeches. But in spite of the pandemic, here we are all together today. I would like to thank all the MEPs that have participated in this conference and how they express their concerns and their interest in the pains and plight of the Iranian people. I am grateful to all of them and also to former members like myself. And I am also glad that all colleagues have brought attention to a focal point, which is human rights abuse in Iran and the dangerous situations of the political prisoners under torture and how they face not only torture, but execution. They were very right to highlight this very hard report by Amnesty International about the tortures and about the epidemic. If all these things are true, and of course, indeed they are, we all have a very serious concern about the inaction of the European Union and the High Representative. Let's look at two recent cases. I refer to two political prisoners, Navid Afkari and Mustafa Salehi, both arrested during the regime protest, and Amnesty International urged actions on them, calling for a campaign to stop these barbaric executions. What did the European Union do in this regard? Nothing, absolutely nothing. They waited. Josep Borrell, the External Action Service, the national governments, they waited until they were executed. And then they posted a tweet of condemnation. Navid and Mustafa could have been alive today if the European Union and their leaders and the member states should have acted promptly and took concrete and strong action to stop these murders. They could have done many things to put pressure on the regime, but they didn't. And Navid and Mustafa are dead. Many members today spoke about the appalling situation of human rights in Iran, and I know for sure that there are many more members in the parliament, in the European Parliament, which are very concerned about it. They could not join us today, but I know they think exactly as we do. It was a similar situation when I was vice president of the European Parliament. Many of us asked to the high representatives of those days, Lady Ashton and Mogherini, they asked them to not to ignore the brutalities of the regime and act firmly. Unfortunately, they did not listen to us, and the reaction was the same as it is today, doing absolutely nothing. Today, the European Union and United Nations are following, and they do very right, the situation in Belarus, and they protest and they call for punitive action. This is very good, and we wish them success. But the question is, why in Belarus they act and the atrocities of the Iranian regime do not deserve the same attention? Why? Because in Belarus the protesters are suffocated, are beaten, yes, but they are not executed, not taken to torture chambers, being tortured to death. They are not hanged. Why Belarus deserves the attention of Mr. Borrell and Iran does not? somebody could explain to us this mystery. The United Nations sent a fact-finding mission to Venezuela. Very good, congratulations. Why do not they send a fact-finding mission to Iran, where things are so, or I would say, so bad or even worse, much worse than in Venezuela? How can the European Union and the United Nations remain silent in face of all these savage killings in Iran, just to save the nuclear deal? But the nuclear deal must be paid with a price, which is the life of so many innocent Iranians. The nuclear deal deserves a bloodshed in Iran. Nothing serious is done to stop the brutal killing of all these innocent demonstrators that they are entitled to protest according to the United Nations Charter and according to the declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Where are our European principles? Where? Why they are silent when all these terrible things are happening in Iran? How can the European Union leaders look to the eyes of the Iranian people who are suffering under the most brutal tyranny of many, many years and just do nothing? How can they look to the eyes to the two little children, the two little kids of Mustafa Saleh? Can they look into the eyes to these two children and tell them they did nothing while his father was being murdered by this regime? This must end, and this must end now. Enough is enough. The role of the European Parliament to stop this criminal theocracy of the mullahs is crucial. There are many members that reject this pusillanimous policy of the European Union and want to change it to a more committed and more firm stance. The European Parliament must keep and redouble the pressure on the Council, on the High Representative, on the European External Action Service until they take real action to protect the Iranian people from the brutal oppression of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and his thugs. The International Committee in Search of Justice will always be on your side for this pressing and morally necessary task. Thank you very much.
Buongiorno a tutti, saluto gli organizzatori di questo incontro, i colleghi europarlamentari presenti e tutti i partecipanti a questo dibattito. Sono più di 40 anni che l'Iran tiene in apprensione una parte della comunità internazionale per le sistematiche e inaccettabili violazioni dei diritti umani e delle libertà fondamentali, seguite alla rivoluzione islamica del 79. Oggi la situazione, che è ulteriormente peggiorata, richiede oltre a una maggiore attenzione e vigilanza anche interventi concreti da parte dell'Europa e soprattutto delle Nazioni Unite, di cui l'Iran è uno Stato membro. La popolazione iraniana è sempre meno favorevole al regime, sempre più affamata di cibo, di giustizia, di libertà e sempre più prossima a suscitare una rivolta di massa, che rischia di essere repressa con conseguenze gravissime. La situazione economica e sociale, già disperata, si è ulteriormente aggravata a causa del Covid, colpevolmente mal gestito dal regime islamico, che ha impedito la diffusione delle informazioni e nascosto la reale dimensione della pandemia. Di fronte ai 106.000 morti delle stime ufficiali e agli ospedali al collasso, il presidente Hassan Rouhani ha infatti rifiutato con sdegno gli aiuti umanitari messi a disposizione dagli Stati Uniti, nonostante l'embargo, e ha rimandato al mittente persino le forniture medico-ospedaliere offerte da organizzazioni umanitarie indipendenti come Medici Senza Frontiere, che è stata infatti poi espulsa dal paese. L'Iran ha evidentemente rifiutato questi aiuti per strumentalizzare la pandemia con lo scopo di sopprimere ogni residua libertà di informazione e inasprire ulteriormente la repressione delle proteste di piazza, che hanno già causato 1.500 morti e più di 12.000 arresti. Mi rammarica che sia proprio una donna a invocare la linea morbida contro il regime iraniano. Sappiamo infatti che le donne in Iran sono le più esposte alla violenza, che riguarda ben il 66% della popolazione femminile, e alle più turpi forme di violazione dei diritti umani. Hassan Rouhani, il presidente definito riformista, ha promosso iniziative di emancipazione femminile di facciata, come la nomina di 3 vicepresidenti donne, ma durante il suo mandato sono già state impiccate ben 106 donne, principalmente per reati contro le leggi coraniche, mentre altre 400 sono state uccise dalla polizia soltanto durante le manifestazioni di protesta del novembre scorso. Tra le innumerevoli oppositrici arrestate ricordo Nasrin Sotoudeh, l'avvocata insignita del premio Sakharov dal Parlamento europeo, condannata a 38 anni di carcere e 148 frustate, e come Vida Moavedi, attivista per i diritti umani, incarcerata per aver tolto e sventolato il velo come una bandiera. Le intimidazioni e le repressioni nei riguardi delle donne si sono inasprite da quando le iraniane hanno poi deciso di lottare, diffondendo in tutto il mondo attraverso il web gli abusi della polizia del cosiddetto buon costume. Non è dunque più procrastinabile l'organizzazione di una missione internazionale che possa visitare le carceri, specialmente quelle in cui sono detenute le oppositrici politiche. Anche fuori dalle prigioni, purtroppo, le donne iraniane non possono definirsi libere. Nei numerosi stati in cui vige la legge islamica della Sharia, le donne sono considerate inferiori agli uomini, subiscono limitazioni, discriminazioni e umiliazioni, non possono lavorare né sposarsi senza il benestare del tutore, che è sempre un uomo, non possono uscire di casa da sole, ma devono essere sempre accompagnate. Secondo il Gender Gap Report del 2019, l'Iran occupa il 148° posto su 153 paesi per quanto riguarda i diritti delle donne. Nonostante il 65% di loro sia laureata, solo il 18% lavora e solo il 6% siede in Parlamento. Come membro della Commissione FEM del Parlamento europeo ho particolarmente a cuore la questione iraniana, e per questo sono intervenuta nella seduta plenaria che ha approvato una risoluzione di sostegno delle donne in Iran contro la violazione dei diritti umani e femminili e per la liberazione di tutte le attiviste incarcerate. Credo infatti che l'Europa, che fonda le sue radici sui valori della libertà e della responsabilità, non possa accettare le violazioni dei diritti della persona praticate da un sistema politico e culturale arcaico ed ipocrita che utilizza la religione islamica per imporre il proprio potere assoluto. Questo fanatismo purtroppo sta diffondendo anche nelle città europee la sottocultura del sopruso sulle donne, con la complicità di una politica miope che si batte per il diritto al velo in Europa come se fosse un privilegio e non un'imposizione. Non possiamo rassegnarci ricorrendo all'alibi della diversità culturale. Dobbiamo sostenere le donne in Iran e al tempo stesso salvaguardare i nostri valori occidentali. Per questo è necessario che la solidarietà dell'Europa e del mondo nei confronti delle donne iraniane siano estese anche a tutte le donne di religione islamica presenti in Occidente e in tutti i luoghi del mondo in cui il fanatismo religioso mette a rischio i diritti femminili. Con l'augurio che questo incontro possa muovere le coscienze e gli organismi internazionali sulla situazione iraniana, vi ringrazio per l'attenzione e auguro a tutti voi una proficua prosecuzione dei lavori.
Thank you very much. And now it is time to speak to the member of the Conseil provincial de la Val d'Oise, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Müller.
Oui, chers amis, chère Mariam Radjavi et chers amis du Parlement européen, je suis vraiment ravi d'être avec vous cet après-midi. Même si c'est en visioconférence, nous aurions bien aimé naturellement être les uns à côté des autres en vrai, si je puis dire les choses comme ça. En tout cas, je vous adresse le salut fraternel des élus de France avec le coprésident qui est à mes côtés, Jean-François Legarret, depuis des années et des années pour vous apporter notre soutien et les marques de notre amitié aux Moudjahidines du peuple et à Mariam Radjavi. Et j'ai été ravi de vous entendre les uns et les autres exprimer avec force votre solidarité, votre volonté aussi affirmée d'être à vos côtés dans ces moments difficiles. Pour le moins, l'Iran aujourd'hui, avec le régime des mollahs, est une tâche de barbarie, une tâche dictatoriale à la surface du monde. Car chacun l'a dit aussi, et je le répète avec force, le régime des mollahs est un régime criminel. Criminel à l'intérieur parce que, eh bien, il fait souffrir, il martyrise son peuple, ses hommes, ses femmes et ses enfants, vous l'avez dit également les uns et les autres. À l'extérieur, naturellement, parce que c'est un régime toxique, c'est un régime dangereux pour la région, mais aussi pour le monde, et dangereux aussi jusque chez nous. Il y a été fait référence aussi avec ce projet d'attentat qui, heureusement, a échoué pour faire éclater une bombe à notre grand rassemblement de Villepinte. Alors aujourd'hui, ça a été dit aussi, mais je le répète parce qu'il faut le dire et le répéter avec force et que cela devienne une réalité. Ça ne peut pas continuer comme ça. Ça ne peut pas continuer comme ça. Et le monde libre, l'Union européenne, le monde occidental, le monde entier, à mon sens, au-delà des amis de plus en plus nombreux de Mariam Radjavi et des Moudjahidines du peuple, sont bien trop timorés face aux mollahs. La situation se dégrade à grands pas, ça a été dit aussi en Iran, le peuple souffre et il faut réagir avec force et sans faille et sans faiblesse. Les Moudjahidines du peuple doivent, à travers le monde, être maintenant reconnus comme la première force de résistance et d'alternative, d'alternance en Iran. Il faut rétablir naturellement les droits de l'homme, il faut qu'il y ait un embargo qui perdure pour mettre à genoux et chasser les mollahs. Ça se traduit aussi par l'expulsion, cela a été dit, mais il faut que l'on le répète, par l'expulsion eh bien, de tous ceux qui n'ont de diplomate que le nom. Il faut aussi qu'au-delà de nos rangs, au-delà de nos réunions, chacun sache là où il est, par les travaux et les conclusions d'une mission internationale d'enquête, ce que ont été les massacres perpétrés par ce triste régime. Il faut que sans délai, eh bien, les prisonniers politiques soient libérés, parce que ce régime est un des pires, un des plus dangereux, un des plus détestables de la planète. La négation ô combien des droits de l'homme, les droits humains les plus élémentaires, la torture, les exécutions et naturellement les emprisonnements. En ce jour où nous nous levons à nouveau contre la peine de mort, eh bien, il faut que chacun entende ce message. Vraiment, il faut que chacun comprenne aussi que l'Iran des mollahs, ce n'est pas l'Iran. L'Iran, c'est un grand pays, c'est une lapalissade que de dire ça. C'est un pays avec une histoire ô combien importante, sans pareil, avec une culture, avec la beauté de ses paysages, c'est ça l'Iran. Et je le répète, ce régime constitue, je reprends l'expression de tout à l'heure, vraiment une tâche de barbarie, une tâche dictatoriale à la surface de notre planète, à la surface du monde. Ce qui me console, ce qui me renforce, je ne sais pas comment dire les choses, c'est vraiment que d'année en année, nous sommes toujours plus nombreux. Nous sommes avec nos amis députés européens aujourd'hui. Je parlais des élus de France. Lorsque nous nous réunissions avant la Covid à Villepinte, eh bien, il y avait des délégations du monde entier et nous étions réunis dans ce qu'on peut appeler la même famille, les amis de la liberté, de la démocratie. Voilà, chers amis, j'ai hâte de vous revoir à Villepinte ou ailleurs. Et j'ai hâte aussi que nous nous retrouvions le moment venu et bien à Téhéran sur la place de la liberté. À bientôt.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Muller. Merci de Monsieur Vidal-Quadras. Vous êtes toujours avant-garde pour une politique juste vis-à-vis le régime des mollahs. Et aussi être aux côtés du peuple iranien et de la résistance iranienne. Et quelques mots pour conclusion. Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, je souhaite vous remercier pour vos discours. Vous avez défendu avec courage et avec force le droit du peuple iranien à la liberté et la démocratie. Vous avez soutenu les droits, les droits des prisonniers politiques et, comme l'a souligné la haute commissaire des droits de l'homme hier, leur situation en prison est très préoccupante à cause de la pandémie. Vous avez aussi soutenu le peuple iranien et les médecins et infirmières qui essayent de sauver la vie des malades du Covid sans aucun moyen en Iran. Le régime des mullahs est directement responsable du nombre croissant de victimes du Covid. Khamenei et Rouhani utilisent les ressources du pays dans la guerre, le terrorisme et les projets nucléaires et de missiles. Le nombre de décès approche des 120 000 en Iran. Il faut dissoudre les gardiens de la révolution et utiliser leur budget pour soigner les malades de Covid. Et il faut faire entendre la voix du peuple iranien. Et le Parlement européen joue un rôle déterminant. Et il faut pousser les États membres à se tenir aux côtés du peuple iranien, spécialement pour dans leur combat pour la liberté et la démocratie et pour faire entendre la voix du peuple iranien. Encore une fois, je vous remercie pour votre soutien. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. President. I think this has been a great event, a great conference. It was very timing. The attendance has been really extraordinary, with so many members, so many former members and others. Your speech has been very inspiring, Mrs. President. And I think that we can draw some conclusions of this conference. The first conclusion is that national parliaments and the European Parliament in Europe must be really the spearhead of the action to give democracy and freedom to Iran, because national governments and European Council and High Representative, unfortunately, do very little, not to say they do nothing. So, crucial role for the national parliaments and for the European Parliament. And the second conclusion is that the situation in Iran has come to a level of oppression, of brutality, of criminal suppression by the regime, that this situation is really untenable and it must finish. All of us who have spoken today, we have been fighting for years together with you, Mrs. Rajavi, and the Iranian resistance to change this terrible situation. It is time that the national governments and the European External Action Service and the High Representative do also effective action. The Iranian people cannot wait longer. If they do nothing, if they go on with this lack of action, every innocent life that will be lost in Iran in the hands of this regime will be a responsibility of those that do nothing. Once again, we must remember the words of Edmund Burke: the evil men win when the good men do nothing. Thank you very much. I wish you well.